The Dragon Age franchise has notoriously never shied away from depicting class, religious, and ethnic tensions between its characters. But while elves and Kunari might not exist in our world, the writers have admitted that they're based on cultures that do. Back in 2009, when the first game and books were released, narrative lead David Geider went on record saying that the city elves and their experiences were based on those of Jews, while their nomadic Jaelish counterparts were based on Roma and Indigenous Americans. In more recent years, many of the franchise's writers have expressed regret surrounding these parallels. But it's kinda too late to take them back. Dragon Age's real-world inspirations are common knowledge and also kinda obvious to the majority of fans, along with being too deeply ingrained in over a decade of world building to just be able to retcon. They're part of the franchise now, for better or worse. So, let's talk about them. A couple of years ago, a Mi'kmaq Dragon Age blogger known as Delicious created a resource that compiled some of the parallels between real-world Indigenous people and Dragon Age's elves. I've linked it in the description below, along with their coffee. I highly recommend you guys check it out. That resource inspired me, and made me want to create a similar one about the franchise's Jewish inspirations. But then, when I sat down and actually started organizing my thoughts, I realized there were way too many parallels for me to fit in a single video. After all, we're talking about a franchise with golems and phylacteries. You didn't know those were Jewish? Well, you are gonna be surprised by how many things that you consider staples of the fantasy franchise actually have their roots in Jewish cultures, and the myths that were spread to demonize them. This video is just the first in what will be a multi-part series discussing the Jewishness of Dragon Age. I'm hoping to get all of the episodes up here on YouTube before the 4th game can drop and completely destroy the lore. With that in mind, please keep the comments section free of Veilguard-related spoilers, not just for me, but for your fellow fandom members. I promise that we'll get to talk about that game and how it relates to these videos in the future. Today's episode is going to talk about dwarves, but future episodes will cover topics such as golems, magic, the chantry, and of course, elves. Before we can get to the dwarves though, I have a couple of disclaimers that will be relevant throughout the series. 1. I'll only be discussing Dragon Age's Jewish influences. This is not to say that the concepts and experiences in this video are unique to Jews, or that Jewish cultures are the only ones that possibly could have inspired this in Dragon Age. 2. While some of these parallels have been confirmed as purposeful, others might just be coincidences. However, being unintentional doesn't mean something's not there. These parallels could be the result of unconscious bias, or inspiration taken from properties where these parallels were intentional. And hey, even for the situations that are coincidences, I hope that this video will help you understand why some Jewish fans might feel particularly strongly about them. 3. I am just one Jew with a limited range of experiences who is sharing my opinions and observations, not those of all Jewish people. Please remember that the term Jewish encompasses multiple distinct cultures, religious sects, and ethnic groups. We are far from a monolith. The customs that this series will touch upon aren't universal to all Jewish communities, and are biased towards the ones that I am most familiar with. 4. Judaism, both culturally and religiously, is a closed practice. This means we don't appreciate it when non-Jews appropriate things from us, such as by hosting celebrations of our holidays, or putting creatures that come from our folklore into their creative works. This is because when people do this, it often spreads misinformation about the appropriated concept in a way that overwrites its key cultural context and perpetuates anti-Semitism. This series, especially the Golem episode, will discuss some of the times that Dragon Age has done this. 5. That said, none of my critiques should be interpreted as a call to cancel Dragon Age or the people who've worked on it. I love this series, and am making these criticisms because I want to see it improve. Getting up on a soapbox to yell at and shame members of the Dragon Age community for mistakes that they've made, instead of talking with them and giving people a chance to grow, doesn't make you a superior activist. It makes you a self-righteous asshole. Okay. Now that we've cleared that up, you might be wondering why I chose to begin this series with dwarves of all topics. After all, it's not like the teams ever explicitly compared them to Jews the way that they've done with the elves. So, who are the dwarves based on? Well, with all that fuss about their beards, there's obviously some influence from Tolkien, who in turn was inspired by the dwarves of Germanic mythology. But isn't Tolkien that guy who said,
"The dwarves, of course, quite obviously, couldn't you say in many ways they remind you of the Jews? All their words are Semitic, obviously, and constructed be Semitic. There's a tremendous love of the artifact, and of course the immense warlike capacity of the Jews, too, which we tend to forget nowadays."
He wasn't even the first person to think of them as such, and was actually building off of a larger, pre-existing European tradition of using Dwarven characters as stand-ins for Jewish ones. Let's go back to some of the earliest instances of this. Dwarves as a mythical species have appeared in Europe's pagan folklore and Christian literature for at least 1,000 years, but in the 13th century, depictions of them began to shift. Up until this period, European Jews had dressed virtually identically to their Christian neighbors. However, said neighbors were not fond of the fact that they couldn't tell at a glance whether someone was Jewish. This led to laws being introduced all across Europe that required Jews to wear a distinguishing mark whenever in public. What form this mark took varied from country to country, but in German-speaking lands, this mark was the Judenhut, the Jew's hat. It didn't take long for dwarves to start being depicted in these hats, when previously it had been standard to draw their heads bare. Now, some of you mythology geeks might be typing in the comments right now, but what about all those stories where dwarves draw their powers of invisibility from their hats? Well, those details were later additions from this period. Traditionally, if any part of a dwarf's outfit was considered magical, it was their cloaks. But when those older myths were retold during this period, those cloaks were replaced with Jews' hats. And it wasn't only dwarves that European Christians were suddenly depicting in Jews' hats, but also ogres, witches, and sorcerers. This turned an item that Jews were legally required to appear in whenever in public into a symbol of danger and deception, spreading the message that Jews had similar intentions to those of these fairy tale villains. Coding dwarves as Jews continued beyond their clothing into their physical appearances. They were often drawn or described as having features stereotypically associated with Jews. If you live in Europe, just think of how many dark-haired dwarves you've seen depicted with, and mocked for, their giant noses. Dwarves being of short stature further matched European stereotypes that depicted Jews, and especially Jewish men, as shorter than their Christian counterparts, in order to imply that the former were biologically inferior to the latter. While there have been historic censuses in which Ashkenazi Jews have stood a few centimeters shorter than the local average, not me though, I'm 5'7", scholars have proposed that these height discrepancies were caused by the poor health conditions of the Jewish ghettos. Some of the most influential works from this period depicted dwarves as invasive migrants from lands such as Sinai and Judea, both territories that Europeans heavily associated with Judaism. Another area that dwarves were often associated with and said to rule was the Caucasus Mountains. But it was also said that this area was controlled by a tribe of red-bearded warrior Jews who only left the mountains if there was a battle great enough to— Wait, Arbrid? One last major link between how dwarves and Jews were depicted relates to material wealth and trade. For centuries, there were laws across Europe that prevented Jews from pursuing certain professions, joining guilds, or owning land, which pushed many of them into the economic and trading industries. And what do you know? By the end of this period, dwarves had also become associated with those professions. There were some ancient tales that linked dwarves to magic rings, gemstones, and hoards of treasure, but these associations became increasingly vilified as Jews started moving into the financial and jewelry industries. While the glorified tales of Christian knights attacking dwarves to loot their treasures are fictional, things get very real once you swap out Jews as the victims. Throughout history, there have been violent, financially motivated raids against Jewish people and communities that were conducted to seize usually non-existent treasures or wealth that these tales of dwarves had taught Christians to assume all Jews possessed. Anti-Semitic works that blurred the lines between dwarves and Jews made the former more popular than they'd been since the arrival of Christianity. But these tales didn't die out in the Middle Ages. They've continued to appear in Nazi propaganda and retellings linked to white supremacy. However, they've also influenced major fantasy franchises that many of you are probably fans of, such as Dungeons & Dragons or Lord of the Rings. Speaking of the latter, it's time we talk Tolkien. Since Dragon Age Origins released in 2009, fans have pointed out parallels between Thedas and Middle-earth, especially in regards to its dwarves with their beards and breweries. As I mentioned in the intro, Tolkien outright admitted on multiple occasions that his dwarves were based on Jews. Their language has the same roots and consonants as Hebrew, and he initially even planned to give the dwarven characters Semitic names before his editor shot the idea down and demanded Scandinavian ones instead. Tolkien's early works played into anti-Semitic stereotypes by depicting the dwarves as greedy, gold-obsessed, thrifty tricksters who were biologically primed to bestow. This wasn't fueled by active malice towards Jewish people. Tolkien considered himself a Jewish ally and was openly critical of anti-Semitism. Instead, it was the result of cultural ignorance, a reliance upon stereotypes, and a lack of reflection of how this world building came across. When later into his career, Tolkien did reflect on some of his earlier works, he removed certain passages from subsequent printings, retconned bits of the lore, and added the character of Gimli to show a more positive side of the dwarves. I think much of Dragon Age's world building can be critiqued through a similar lens. Not intentionally malicious, but still ultimately harmful due to a lack of consideration that was afforded the context surrounding certain concepts. In Dragon Age, dwarves are split between two groups, those that live underground and those that live on the surface. Surface dwarves, like their Jewish-coded inspirations, are depicted as a diasporic people who specialize in money and merchandise. In the first two games, practically all of the surface dwarf characters you encounter, from the Fedic family to Gorim to the iconic Tethris brothers, are merchants or traders. In conversation with Anders, Varric confirms that there are very few professions out there for surface dwarves.
We come to the surface with the skills our ancestors had, Blondie. You think there's a tradition of dwarf woodcutters in Orzammar?
The majority of them are involved in the Dwarven Merchants Guild, an organization with so much power that many consider it to be the surface dwarves' unofficial government. This selective club is said to quietly control the entire economy of Orzammar, though the government would never admit it. And its influence isn't limited to dwarven communities. While exploring Kirkwall with Varric, we learn that the Merchants Guild owns, invests in, and profits off of most of the city's shadier businesses. At one point, when the human Sebastian gets the guild mixed up with the Carta, which is essentially the Dwarven Mafia, Varric responds,
"Are you kidding? The Carta is only the worst gang of thugs in Orzammar. Their main trades are lyrium smuggling, gambling, and murder for hire."
I'm sorry, I didn't know.
So yes, basically just like the guild.
It's in regards to this organization that I'd like to make my first critique of the franchise's world building. I feel the Merchants Guild dances not only with anti-Semitic stereotypes, but outright conspiracy theories. We've already established that dwarven relationships to trade have historically been thinly veiled metaphors for Jewish ones. So whenever you do a depiction of dwarves that involves economics, you need to tread carefully. Creating a corrupt elite society of this minority group that secretly controls most of the economy and profits off of shady businesses is not navigating carefully. One of the most infamous anti-Semitic conspiracy theories out there is the idea that there's a tiny group of Jews that control the majority of the world's economy. Again and again, even today, we have heads of state from Russia to Malaysia trying to scapegoat Jews whenever their country's economies suffer, even though it's often due to their poor decisions. And this conspiracy theory isn't a harmless joke. It's fueled multiple violent acts of anti-Semitism that have taken lives, such as the Tree of Life shooting in Pittsburgh. The Merchants Guild's role as moneylenders continues to play off of anti-Semitic stereotypes, where despite the majority of professional moneylenders, money changers, bankers, and merchants in medieval Europe being Christian, medieval literature and art disproportionately depicted Jews in these positions to portray our people as parasites that profited off of exploiting Christians. Heck, even the relationship between the Merchants Guild and Orzammar, especially in regards to the lyrium trade, mimics the mythical one that Europeans claimed was present between their Jews and the Red Jews, those guys from the Caucasus Mountains who I compared to Ogren, in which the latter would gather dangerous substances for the former to then sell and utilize in illicit activities. Portraying this corrupt organization as something akin to a second government for the surface dwarves echoes the anti-Semitic motif of dual loyalty, in which it is assumed that Jews will be more loyal to Jewish organizations than to the countries they live in. This stereotype has been used by non-Jewish nationalists to portray their Jewish countrymen not only as untrustworthy, but as an active threat to national security. This has then been used by countries to justify the murder, mistreatment, and expulsion of their Jewish citizens. The second most important organization in surface dwarf society is the Carta, a crime group that profits off of smuggling weapons, lyrium, surface luxuries, people, and other goods between Orzammar and human lands. Jews have been stereotyped as smugglers for centuries, to the point where, during the American Civil War, the word Jew was treated as a catch-all term for smuggler. But let's take a critical look at what inspired this stereotype. Jewish refugees have had to smuggle themselves in and out of countries with anti-Semitic traveling laws since at least the Spanish Inquisition, often in situations where staying put would have meant death. The reputation we gained for being able to sneak across borders made our new neighbors wonder what, or perhaps even who, we were bringing with us. This led to accusations of varying validity that Jews were trafficking both goods and people in and out of these countries. Hi, this is me while editing. I never played Legacy, and so I didn't know what the plot of it was until I was trying to find a clip of one particular line from it, and I learned that apparently the plot is the Carta try to kidnap you to harvest your blood for a dark magic ritual. It's even more anti-Semitic than I thought. This stereotype was especially prevalent in Europe, where Jews had to deal with anti-Semitic laws and customs officials, who would sometimes falsely label legally obtained Jewish property as smuggled simply so they could seize it for themselves. As I mentioned previously, there were many financially motivated raids and expulsions conducted against Jewish communities, so sometimes members of those communities holding on to property that had been in their families for generations instead of giving it up to the crown when demanded was labeled smuggling. European Jews have historically lived under similar conditions to the population that makes up the majority of the Carta, the casteless dwarves of Orzammar. The latter live in a practically crumbling neighborhood on the fringes of the city called Dust Town, while the former were restricted by law to similar neighborhoods known as ghettos. We'll discuss ghettos further when we get to the city elves, since they were the explicit inspiration for the alienages. During the Holocaust, smuggling became the only means of survival for many Jewish communities. In Belgium, which refused Jews war rations, the only way to obtain food was to buy it on the black market. In Poland, infants had to be smuggled out of the ghettos in toolboxes and coffins so that the Nazis wouldn't kill them. Brother Genetivi's claims that the majority of casteless dwarves are bound to become criminal members of the Carta who freely break their word, double-cross allies, and renege on deals feel uncomfortably similar to ones made by Nazis about Jews to justify not just our expulsion, but extermination. We've already discussed how Jews have been required throughout European history to wear marks signaling their Jewish identities to others. But the concentration camp Auschwitz took this to a whole new extreme by forcibly tattooing its prisoners with identification numbers. Meanwhile, in Dragon Age, dwarves who are born or become casteless are branded on their face. Both of these tattoos intend to dehumanize their bearers and permanently prevent them from being able to hide or deny being a member of this stigmatized group. Going back to smuggling, it wasn't just lives that Jewish communities were trying to preserve, it was also cultures. Many precious artifacts and texts that we can still access today only survived this long or came to be in the first place because of the importance Jewish cultures place upon the preservation of history. Record keeping is ingrained into Judaism. Certain portions of the Torah, one of our holy texts, are basically records of people's genealogies, how to perform certain rituals, and the materials used to construct different monuments. Record keeping is singled out as a sacred task, with record keepers being listed in these texts in positions of honor next to tribal leaders and elders. Wherever we go, we have kept archives and understood the importance of documenting our experiences for future generations, especially during times of tragedy. Ashkenazi communities traditionally kept ledgers known as pinkasim that compile receipts and expenditures, the rulings of rabbinical courts, births, deaths, marriages, divorces, and more. These used to be the pride of their communities, often gorgeously illuminated and bound in high-quality materials. Dwarven culture places a similar emphasis upon records, which are maintained by the Shaperate, an organization dedicated to preserving the history and knowledge of the dwarves. Shapers, like Jewish record keepers, are considered blessed within their religion. They bear witness to events both tragic and triumphant, which they then record in the memories. Shapers are encouraged to travel the deep roads and seek out long-buried historical truths, which have been lost to wars against the Darkspawn and the land displacement caused by them. Jews around the world have engaged in similar struggles to recover artifacts from areas that our families fled. In some areas, many of the artifacts we'd be looking for have been either destroyed or stolen. This is complicated even further for communities that come from countries that either are or recently have been at war. Caring for a physical object is one matter, but preserving our ancestral languages has been an entirely different task. While it's helpful to have texts in a variety of tongues, to keep a language alive, you need to actually speak it. And unfortunately, over the past century, the majority of Jewish languages have gone either endangered or extinct. The current state of Jewish languages was caused by a variety of factors. For one, many 20th century Jews moved to new areas that expected them to trade their mother tongues for the local lingua franca, which impeded them from passing on these languages to the next generation. Another was the devastating loss of millions of native speakers of languages such as Italkian, Ladino, and Yiddish to the Holocaust. A final nail in the coffin has been how some countries' governments actively interfered in the passing on of these languages in order to create a more monolithic population. In countries like the Soviet Union, this was done to alienate citizens from their Jewishness. However, in the case of the State of Israel, this was done to alienate Jewish citizens from their diasporic heritages, so they'd be more likely to prioritize Israeli and Zionist identities. Dragon Age's dwarves have lost the majority of their languages as well, and now do almost all of their talking in the common tongue, which they originally only used when trading. In Orzammar, you'll occasionally hear someone throw around a phrase from the older tongues, like Salraka, similarly to how my Ashkenazi tuchus will use words like tuchus in otherwise English sentences, but rarely speak a whole sentence in Yiddish. There are even more similarities between dwarves and Jews in terms of our culture's attitudes towards fertility. The dwarves have low rates of it due to corruption spread by the Darkspawn. This, coupled with how dwarves constantly die at the hands of the Darkspawn, has led to a dwindling population, which in turn has led to paranoia surrounding the population's future and immense pressure upon those within it to have kids. Similar attitudes exist within Jewish communities. After all, in our religion, the first order heaven gave humanity was to be fruitful and multiply. But fulfilling this commandment gets complicated for the 1 out of 6 Jewish couples that struggle with infertility. For some reason, Jewish people have been recorded as statistically more likely to experience infertility than their non-Jewish countrymen since at least the 1880s, just like the dwarves are when compared to non-dwarven species in Dragon Age. Also like the dwarves, Jews are constantly being pushed this narrative that our birth rates are declining, our populations are dying at best, actively being hunted down at worst, kids keep moving out of the area to become atheists, and the only thing we can do to combat these problems is by having more children. Which puts as much pressure on our shoulders as dwarves have hairs on their beards.
I thought all dwarves had beards.
Or at least mustaches, or something.
Speaking of dwarven beards, in Dragon Age, the men are practically defined by theirs. You might assume the link between dwarves and beards dates back to ancient mythology, but nope, it was yet another medieval edition meant to code them as Jewish. In many Jewish communities, the shaving or cutting of one's beard is forbidden. While this never made us stand out much in Islamic or Hindu regions, in Christian ones the fashion was usually to keep yours short, specifically so you wouldn't be mistaken for a Jew. In medieval Christian Europe, long beards were viewed as a distinctly Jewish trait. This meant that if a character was depicted with one, it was usually meant to signal that they were Jewish, and so when dwarves suddenly started sporting long beards, this was no exception. Now, the biggest link between Jews and Dragon Age's dwarves is their association with golems, but we're going to cover that in its own episode. For now, I want to end this one by focusing on one particular dwarf. Guys, Varric's Jewish, come on. He has the chutzpah, he kvetches, he's a short ginger king with a smoochable schnoiz. That was a lot of Yiddish I just used, so let me translate. Chutzpah. This term refers to a certain kind of confidence, a swagger, an audacity that Varric embodies to a T. Kvetch. Overly complaining about something to bond with those around you. Varric complains endlessly. Just look at this clip.
I hate caves.
Yes, yes. You hate the deep roads and caves and the outdoors.
Orlesian cafes, taverns that are too tidy, slopes of greater than 10 degrees.
Also quiet, and most kinds of smells, rain, water in general.
And Orlesians, Fereldans, Navarans, Mages, Templars, the entire Merchant Guild, Nugs.
Look, I have to complain, or you'll forget I'm here and trip over me. I'm providing a service.
Schnoiz, your snout, your sniffer, your nose. Throughout history, Jews have been stereotyped as, mocked for, and dehumanized for having a very specific type of nose, one that's similar in shape to Varric's. Not all Jews have this type of nose, not only Jews have this type of nose, and no matter whose face they're on, they're gorgeous, deserve to be celebrated, and ours to reclaim from anti-Semitic assholes. Don't get me wrong, there are ways that depicting this nose on a character can become anti-Semitic, but we deserve positive examples of characters with this trait too. Varric isn't the example I would pick, considering he's a trickster smuggler who manipulates politics, but we gotta acknowledge it's the second best feature. As for my final piece of evidence, just listen to this clip.
You're not the first Ben Hazrath I've run across. Hawk and I went on a caper with one named Talus. You wouldn't know her by any chance.
Hey, one time I ran into this dwarf on the road. Short, grouchy. You think you might know him?
I'm in the Merchant Guild. 10 Royal says I not only know him, he owes me money.
Oh, well, no, I don't know Talus. Sorry.
Varric plays Jewish geography, a ritual in which a Jewish person will interrogate you about everyone you have ever met until you have a comprehensive list of everyone you know in common. And with that, thank you so much for watching. I hope you found today's video interesting, learned something new, and will return for future episodes. If you want to support me in creating this series, leaving a comment encourages the algorithm to continue recommending it to people. I also have a Patreon where I post sneak peeks, weekly updates, and bonus content. For a pledge of as little as $1 a month, your name can appear in the credits of future videos. With that, I thank you all for your attention. Be well, stay safe out there, and I'll see you next month when we get to talk golems.